Hi, my name is Codex, and in this video I will be discussing my UI and how I used the design framework laid out in my last video to create it. While this video should be understandable on its own, certain descriptions may be a little bit confusing if you haven't watched that video. You should see a card in the top right of your screen to go to that video if you would like to watch it. Before diving in, there are a few bits of housekeeping that I need to bring up. First, as you can clearly see, this is a long video. I encourage you to make use of the extensive timestamping that I've done to find the specific topic or add-on that you want to know more about if you're not interested in watching the entire video. Second, allow me to immediately disappoint many of you by saying that I will not be providing my complete UI as a package for you to download. My reasoning for not making it available is this. I believe that the process of creating your own UI inherently makes it more powerful. This is because when you create it yourself, you will have a much better understanding of the nuances, the quirks, the weird edge cases, and etc. And also, setting up the UI forces you to become more familiar with the add-ons that you're using, which then enables future UI modifications, which you're going to have to do at some point because that's just the nature of UIs. Now, while I'm not going to be providing my entire UI, I will be providing links to certain pieces of my UI that I think that are either unique, useful, or were simply sufficiently annoying to set up that I think that they're worth sharing. You can find links to those pieces in the description of this video. As I go over and explain my UI, it should be noted that a number of the decisions that I've made regarding my UI are due to a combination of personal idiosyncrasies and also some unusual use cases. First, I very much err on the side of wanting to have more information over wanting less information, even if that information only becomes minimally useful or even mostly trivial. Second, I very much prefer erring on the side of control over convenience. Third, occasionally I will be the point of view for my guild's raid leader. This means that they will monitor the raid from my perspective via me streaming on Discord and then make calls that way. Because of this, there are some UI elements that are redundant as my raid leader prefers the information presented to them in a particular way that just doesn't simply jive with me. So rather than forcing one of us to change, I decided to double up. Additionally, this means that there are certain UI elements that are there for them and not really for me, as they want the ability to see and know certain pieces of information that will help them make better decisions when making raid calls, but wouldn't normally be considered to be important or useful to me. I will be pointing out these elements as they come up. So with that out of the way, let's start talking about my UI and the design philosophy and design decisions that I made when I was building it. When I was creating this UI, I had a few initial ideas of what I wanted it to look like. I knew that I wanted to centralize the most important information as much as possible. I knew that I wanted to maintain symmetry as much as reasonably possible. I also wanted it to be something that would work well for DPSing, but also needed to be not awful if I decided to tank. Finally, while it was primarily built for my warrior, I also wanted it to be suitable for my ults if I didn't feel like making a unique UI for that character. I consider player and target information to be some of the most important information that there is. My reasoning for this belief is that if you're dead, who really cares about how much rage you have or what's the cooldown on your abilities? And the same goes for if your target's dead. So the first thing that I wanted to get sorted was my unit frames. I use Pitbull 4 for my unit frames. I like Pitbull because it offers a ton of control. There's definitely a learning curve to figuring out how to get everything to work properly the way that you want, but I think the payoff is definitely worth that effort. The first issue that I had was what to do about target-of-target information. I absolutely wanted to have a target-of-target unit frame, and the obvious solution to maintain symmetry was to put it between the player and the target unit frames. But the issue that I had with this was that I don't think that the target-of-target information was that important to put in such a prime location. The solution that I came up with was to remove the bar that I used to display the name and class color for my unit frames, and to put a target-of-target health bar that looks exactly like it in its place. Conveniently, doing this allowed me to gain some additional symmetry down the road with tracking buffs on my target because I could do the same thing, but for debuffs on the target-of-target frame. The second issue that I had was that I wanted a better solution for tracking my HP. I really enjoy having health information change color based on its value because it creates another way that you can track the state of your HP or your target's HP. What I mean by this is that you can see how full the bar is, you can see what the text actually says, and with the addition of coloring it by the state of your health, you can tell what health you're at by what color it is. The problem that I had with having my entire health bar colored by my current health is that I have pretty bad ADHD. It was just too distracting for me. So my solution was to just have the text colored by the HP percentage. Getting to what I have now was an entire process to get set up because it's not a default option in Pitbull. After a lot of Googling, I was able to find an old forum post where somebody had shared a code snippet to color the percentage health that you were at by what percentage you were. In addition to the health percentage, I also wanted to be able to see the current health of my target, which in order to maintain symmetry meant that I also had to do that for the player frame as well. Leaving these numbers as just fixed colors just didn't look right, didn't look good, so I had to modify the code snippet to show the current health value colored by the HP percentage as well. If you are interested in adding these text colorings to your UI, check the video description for a pastebin link. In it, you will find snippets for the HP percent colored by the current HP also colored by current HP, and then also a health deficit colored by current HP, though note for that one that it hides if you're at 100% health. In that pastebin link, there's also a step-by-step explanation of how to add these texts into your unit frames. There was also a nagging problem that I had with putting my player frame in the middle of my screen, and that was the fact that old habits die hard, and I've been so accustomed to right-clicking my player frame in the top left of my screen to leave groups, set dungeon or raid difficulties, put raid markers on myself, so on and so forth, that it literally felt unplayable to me to not have something there for me to do that. So my solution was to create an entire second player frame and just put it where I had grown accustomed to having it. The one advantage that this allowed me was that I could put certain player information there that was useful but not really important to keep right in front of me, such as combat status and also back in BFA and Legion, the artifact or Azerite power. One of these days, I'm just going to have to grow up, be an adult, and remove that unit frame because it really doesn't need to be there, but for the time being, it stays. Now, I knew that I wanted my rage bar in the middle of my screen, but unfortunately, Pitbull does not allow you to completely disconnect pieces of the unit frame. Meaning that if I wanted to have my rage or power bar to be between the player and target frames, then I had two options. Option 1 was to create an entire new unit frame and have it only show my rage. Option 2 was to use a Weakaura to track my rage. Option 1 seemed like total overkill for what Pitbull is designed to do, and it also really didn't offer that much flexibility. So I went with option 2 and used Weakauras to do that. I decided to make my rage bar as large as it is for a few reasons. First, it makes it easier for me to track my rage with my peripheral vision. 2, I honestly just thought it looked better this way. However, I wanted to maximize the usefulness of that space, so I decided to do two things. First, I placed a global cooldown tracking Weakaura over the top of my rage bar. This Weakaura shows a spark that travels across the rage bar as the GCD cycles. It also shows the total global cooldown duration on the left side of the rage bar. I chose to show the total duration rather than the time remaining because the spark already conveys that information to me, and I think that knowing the total GCD time can help me decide the pace or rhythm of play. Second, I put a text Weakaura to tell me my current strength. This was mostly for the sake of maintaining symmetry, but also because it was kind of neat to see how much strength you had during BFA when you were arms and you got a really beefy test of might proc. It should also be noted that I set up a condition where once I had enough rage to use Rampage, the text displaying my rage would turn yellow. After I had my unit frames and power bar in order, I decided to work on my action bars next. I decided to go with 2 rows of 5 buttons to track my primary abilities and their cooldowns. Then use a second smaller action bar below that to track things like trinkets, defensive cooldowns, and the like. These 2 action bars I call my main action bar block. This main action bar block does not have any keybinds attached to them, and instead I put my keybinds on action bars that I keep constantly hidden. I do this so that I can have an easier time putting abilities in the spots that work best for me, because I don't want to worry about having to move the keybinds around and whatnot as I change abilities or talents or etc. And I also find that it makes getting started on setting up this UI for alts easier. Beneath the main action bar block is the secondary action bar block. The main reason for this is mostly just as a lazy solution to a self-imposed problem. You see, I like to hide my main action bar block out of combat, but there are certain things that I would still like to know the cooldown status of while I'm outside of combat. So I created that secondary block to track those things, as well as some other things that are useful, but not important enough to put in the main block, such as potion cooldowns and hellstones and stuff like that. At some point, I intend to work on creating a better solution to this, which will hopefully free up most, if not all of that space, and would allow me to move my details windows together and move other things around, but for now, this is what I've got. I think it's also worth mentioning that the gap between the main action bar block and the secondary block is space for my alternate power bar that gets used on some boss encounters. Once I had mostly figured out what I wanted to do with my action bars, it was time for me to start working on what I was going to do to track various buffs and procs and debuffs that I was applying and things like that. I believe that displaying things as icons is best only if you need to know of the presence or absence of something. And bars are best if you need to know the absence or presence of it and its duration. This is because your peripheral vision is really good at processing position and movement, but it's not really good at details like reading numbers. This means that when you're using your peripheral vision, you'll have an easier time figuring out how much time is left on a buff with a bar rather than an icon with the duration text on it. Now, as a Fury Warrior, I concluded that there were really only 2 buffs that I needed to know the duration of at all times: Enrage and Sudden Death. Therefore, I knew that I was going to track them as bars, but needed to decide what they were going to look like and where I was going to put them. To avoid any potential confusion caused by placing them right next to each other, I decided to put my Enraged bar on top of the power bar and put my Sudden Death bar below the power bar. Doing this forced me to move my action bars down just slightly to accommodate the space for my Sudden Death bar, but I was alright with that. I use these 2 bar locations to track lots of things of similar importance for different classes or specs. For example, I track Shield Block and Ignore Pain when I'm Prot, and Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch on my Shadow Priest in these locations. I then created 2 rows of 5 icon-style Weakauras, which I call my counters. Each icon is in a fixed location so that I can optimize my ability to process the information with my peripheral vision. This is because having specific things show up in fixed locations means that as long as that there is something in the spot for buff X, then that must mean that buff X is up. While it's certainly not anything nearly as pretty as, for example, Titania's Weakaura package, this method provides me with nearly unlimited flexibility to track 10 different things of some sort that I think are important. The numbers displayed in each of these icons is typically the duration, but for example with Whirlwind, the duration is basically pointless to know, so instead the number shows the stacks. Because there are other buffs and procs that I would like to be able to track that simply aren't important enough to warrant being placed into the counters Weakauras, I place these buffs in a dynamic group just below my player frame. By default, the bars are gray, but for certain buffs, such as Berserker Rage and Victorious, I gave them a more contrasting color. I then created a debuff frame in Raven to track all debuffs caused by me on my target. I used Raven here because doing it that way seemed like it would be easier than doing it with Weakauras, but then again, Raven is a bit of a hot mess to try and set up, so maybe it wasn't. Either way, it's working fine for me now, and so that's what I've got. It's also worth noting that occasionally it can be actionable for me to know how many debuffs are on my target beyond simply debuffs caused by me. Therefore, in Pitbull, I turned on target debuffs, but also made mine as small as possible. Now, I think that there's value in monitoring your swing timers, even as Fury, so I created 2 swing timer bars. The yellow one on the right is the main hand, and the blue one on the left is the offhand. To maintain symmetry when I'm playing arms, I duplicate the swing timer and put it in the offhand location as well. The top number specifies how much rage each swing gets, and the bottom number is how long is remaining before this swing occurs. As arms, the mirrored swing timer specifies the swing speed up at the top rather than the rage generated, and to be honest, when I'm playing, I very rarely look at these numbers. I just track the bars moving in my peripheral vision, and the numbers are there for use when I'm practicing or when I'm reviewing recordings. To track debuffs on me, I use Raven. As previously mentioned, Raven's configuration window is a hot mess. I still have no idea what I'm doing 95% of the time, but what I have done is made my debuffs larger and placed them in a more central location. Because of how large I made the icons, it was a bit of an eyesore to have longer duration debuffs that happen frequently be in that location, namely debuffs such as Sated or Exhaustion and things like that. So what I did was I filtered them out of the normal debuffs group and then placed them into a separate debuffs group near my minimap. This way I can still see how much time is left on these debuffs, but it's not right in front of my face for the whole 10 minutes. It should also be noted that with this particular setup, doing PvP can make things get really ugly really fast. For my scrolling combat text, I use MSBT. One of the properties of MSBT is that if a lot of events are occurring in a scroll area, it can make the text move faster than the specified animation speed because it prioritizes showing the event when it occurs over maintaining the animation speed. As a result, I found that sometimes incoming damage would get pushed off the scroll area faster than I'd like due to lots of incoming healing. To mitigate this, I split incoming damage and incoming healing into two separate scroll areas. I have the incoming damage closer to the center of my screen, as I think that it has a greater importance to me than knowing how much I'm being healed for. I also increase the font size of incoming damage to make it much more obvious for me to see. I place these scroll areas on the left half of my screen because that is the side with my player frames and debuffs. I also make the text scroll up because if I'm going to be looking directly at my UI, it's most likely going to be that I'm looking around my action bars or player frame. So I wanted to concentrate the most critical information around that, and as the displayed text ages, it goes away from where I am likely to be looking. I did the same sort of split for incoming buffs and debuffs, with the incoming debuffs area being closer to the center. I purposely left these fonts quite small because the information is mostly trivial to me, but I like having it due to my aforementioned idiosyncrasies. Finally, I put my damage text off on the far right, as that way I can still see it if I want to, but it's not really in my face and likely to distract me. I also have the notification scroll area that shows when any ability with a cooldown greater than 29 seconds comes off cooldown. This also will notify me of sudden death procs for some additional redundancy. I use Bigwigs for my boss mod, and I recently switched to using the Mono UI bar style because I think it makes things look nicer and is easier to read and is also easier to see through. I enable the emphasize bar option and I have it display timers with 7 seconds or less on them. I place it on the right side of my screen to sort of balance out all the information being presented on the left side. The rest of my raid-specific information I generally keep in the upper left corner of my screen. I put my boss frames on the top left of my screen next to my redundant player frame, and next to these boss frames, I have an add-on called DeathClock that estimates how long before the unit dies. So I place the corresponding clock just to the right of the boss unit. To the right of that, I have a Weakaura that tracks raid cooldowns being used and who used them. Now, I didn't create this Weakaura myself, so there is a link to it provided in the description of this video. The placement of these UI elements is done to enhance my raid leader's ability to get actionable information when they're raid leading through my point of view. The death clock for my current target, and also a timer for how long I've been in combat, are located just above my left two details windows. Below the raid cooldowns Weakaura group, I have a separate Weakaura group that tracks my personal defensive cooldowns, any external cooldowns on me, and also any movement speed buffs such as Bounding Stride or Windrush Totem and the like. My reasoning for putting this Weakaura group where it is that if I'm getting one of these effects, such as an external cooldown, then there's a high probability that I need to be looking at my character and where my character is rather than at my action bars. So I place it high on my screen in order to force me to keep my head up and not tunnel vision. I also have a Weakaura group that shows if any raid buffs are missing, as well as if I have a food buff missing. Below that is space that I've reserved for any AngryAssignments notes for whenever my guild decides to use them. I use Grid 2 for my raid frames. Now, since I'm a DPS, I don't really need to have it do anything particularly special, though I do have it track things like personal and raid cooldowns used, as well as raid debuffs being placed on certain players and people getting marked, and pretty much the standard stuff like that. I use the cast bar add-on called Gnosis. I like the amount of control that I have with this add-on, though the add-on does forgo a lot of convenience for the sake of making it lighter weight. This can make configuring bars a tedious process at times. I make my target cast bar excessively large so that I can't ever give the excuse of, I didn't see the cast. I also make it so that if the cast border is black, that means that the spell is interruptible, and if the border is yellow, then it can't be interrupted. Now, here are some miscellaneous things that I think are worth mentioning about my UI, but weren't necessarily critical to the overall design of it. I use plater nameplates. Now, I don't do anything particularly crazy with it, though I am a very big fan of the ability to auto-color the nameplates of any mob with certain names using the NPC colors section of the settings. I also have the unit's name be colored by the threat rather than the bar itself, though this is only relevant when I'm tanking, and that's pretty rare. The text at the bottom of my screen showing frame rate, latency, durability, and etc. is SLDataTexts, or Simple Light Data Text. It's an incredibly old add-on that really hasn't been fully maintained for like 5 expansions, but random people keep fixing it after each one, and I love them for it. To make my action bars and icon Weakauras look nicer, I use Masque, and specifically I use the Caith layout. The primary font that you see me using with my unit frames and most of my Weakauras is the font called Impact. I used the add-on library called SharedMedia and then downloaded the SharedMedia additional fonts add-on. This gives you a ton of different font options for the vast majority of the add-ons that you use. My stat text at the top of my screen is a collection of Weakauras that I personally made, and the font that I'm using for these texts is the Dorse PP font. I created a Weakaura that tracks how much damage prevention I have on my target due to Condemn, located in the middle of my player frame in yellow. One of these days, I will get around to converting it into a short number rather than having it spit out just all of the digits. The number shown in the middle of the target frame is the target's power percentage. This is useful for seeing when bosses are about to do certain abilities. With certain stacking buffs that increase the power of a single ability, such as Overpower stacks, I like to make a small text Weakaura that just displays the number of stacks, and then I place that Weakaura in the corner of the ability on my action bars. To make my cursor more visible in combat, I use a combination of an add-on called Cursor Trail and also a Weakaura. The Weakaura just adds a blue circle around where the cursor is, and that will be there even if I'm holding down the mouse button so the cursor disappears. However, this circle doesn't really help track motion, it's just really good for identifying the position of the cursor, so I then installed Cursor Trail. As the name suggests, Cursor Trail adds a trail-like effect to the cursor whenever you move it around. I have it set to only show this in combat, and I switched it from the default sort of electric effect to a more of a purple line type effect because it's less in your face and less obnoxious, while still allowing me to quickly track the motion of my cursor. I hope this video has helped you understand the nuances and the design philosophy behind my UI. If you have any specific questions that were not covered in this video, then feel free to ask in the comments. I anticipate that I will be able to put out my ARMS guide within a week or two, so feel free to subscribe if you're interested in seeing that video, and that way you'll be notified when it comes out.